Okay, good evening, everybody. Just a couple of words. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to the second appointment of the Department of Linguistic and Literary Studies Higher Education Seminar, Contemporary Liminalities, which is directed by myself and by Professor Annalisa Oboe, who will tell us more about it in a few minutes. I will just mention in advance that the idea of this cycle of hostings with some of the most illustrious exponents of the current literary and theoretical debate aims to explore what I call extreme contemporaneity, which we look at as a threshold where what remains of the old system of understanding the world collides in a borderline frightfully uncertain but open to creativity with new proposals for the articulation of knowledge as well as for the definition of identities and relations. We will talk about queer, post-human, environmental humanities, and decolonial feminism, among other topics. So, leaving the floor now for a brief greeting to Monica Salvadori, who is our Vice Rector for Artistic, Historical, and Cultural Heritage at our university. Thank you very much, Monica, for being here and joining us in welcoming our guests.
Grazie davvero ai colleghi per avermi invitato qui oggi pomeriggio in apertura di questo corso di seminario di alta formazione. E il mio compito oggi pomeriggio è quello di portare i saluti della nostra rettrice e quindi sono particolarmente contenta di essere qui perché veramente è grande la stima nei confronti dei due colleghi, Bizzarri e Oboe, che hanno organizzato il seminario e naturalmente per la nostra relatrice di oggi. È veramente una grande opportunità quella che abbiamo oggi pomeriggio di conoscerti, quindi grazie per essere qui a Padova e ero molto curiosa di sentire poco fa dal collega professor Bizzarri la composizione del gruppo degli studenti, ma non solo, studentesse di varia età che segue questo corso, questo seminario di alta formazione. Mi spiegava lui poco fa che il livello universitario è molto differente, abbiamo molti giovani, abbiamo studenti magistrali, abbiamo anche dottorandi, dottorande del nostro Dipartimento di discipline linguistiche e letterarie, ma poi è un seminario che ha l'ambizione anche di essere aperto all'esterno, di essere aperto alla cittadinanza su tematiche così importanti, naturalmente sul tema del contemporaneo e di questi approcci ai limiti, nella dimensione del limite. Siamo tutti molto veramente attenti in questo momento e io sono un'archeologa e questo approccio al limite mi interessa moltissimo, è un aspetto che noi consideriamo tantissimo nelle relazioni tra mondo dei vivi, mondo dei morti, ad esempio, tra generi, e quindi riflettevamo poco fa, effettivamente io archeologa classica dico forse quando è che si formano questi paradigmi, quando questi limiti si definiscono e quando invece sono molto più ampi e insomma sfuggenti, per cui grazie veramente per l'opportunità e buon pomeriggio a tutti e buon ascolto, grazie.
Grazie mille, thank you very much. So, as I announced, next to speak is my dear colleague Annalisa Oboe. Okay. So,
funziona? No, ecco, grazie. So, good afternoon. Welcome all to this encounter around contemporary liminalities. Thank you for being here, and most of all, welcome Lina Meruane. We have been looking forward to seeing her again. She was here time ago, and I do remember that moment of encounter very, very intensely. And to have you here to talk about what you're going to talk about today, what you promised to talk about today, is momentous, it's timely, and absolutely central to the way we need to think of contemporary culture today. So what I'm going to do now is to describe a little bit what we mean by contemporary liminalities. It is a title that Gabriele and I discussed when planning this high-level seminar, which is part of the Transtext project of excellence of our department, and which is dealing with the absolute contemporary. So the name of this seminar, which is devoted to literary transculturalism, signals one of the key activities at the heart of the Transtext project, and it focuses on global literature and the transcultural trajectories of the most daring, the most experimental literary imaginations of the 21st century. So looking at contemporary global literature and transcultural literary trajectories means to take the contemporary as a primary object of investigation. At least I see it like that. It means to live and to write and to read in time and with time, not in the past, not in the future, but just now, accepting the challenge of living or happening at the same time as ourselves. It means being in transition, or in a state of flux, or in-betweenness. The contemporary manifests itself as a time of thresholds, of passages, of disorientation and ambiguity. That's why it calls for an attention to liminalities, to moments of discomfort, of waiting, or transformation. The word liminal, of course, means threshold. The threshold to a house in its positive meaning. When it comes, other or limits or other things, it is actually in the negative, it's borders that it's difficult to cross. But limen is a threshold. And it can refer to the door between one season of life and the next season, the time between the wound and the healing, the transitional period between childhood and adulthood, as in ancient rituals, for example, or rituals that are of growing up, which are still in place today in many cultures. Liminality can be painful as an experience of destruction and even as an experience of death. Liminality can be chaotic, being a space we enter where we can lose our bearings because the value system we live by is no longer there, is left behind, and we do not know yet what is to come next. Liminality, again, is a place of transformation where we have to embrace the tension between now and the next thing, and what we hope is the next good thing that is going to happen. Liminality is learning to live with tension and pain, and even the boredom of waiting. Waiting. It's a long stretch of time. In the waiting we become. Human life is full of moments and physical spaces where we experience liminality on our way to something else. Literatures and cultures are privileged spaces where we can see this happening in motion, in transition, now, in our time. I believe diasporas, living in diaspora, always on the threshold, always in transformation, are some of the greatest human, social, and cultural challenges one may experience in life. And that is why we need to thank Lina Meruane for being there. I thank Lina for her sharing with us today what this means through her living and her writing, mainly, as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, before I finally introduce Lina, I give the floor to Margherita Rossacco, who will speak on behalf of our PhD program, which will inaugurate its teaching cycle with today's lecture.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad and honored to warmly welcome all of you on behalf of Professor Franco Tomasi, head of the PhD program in Philological, Literary and Linguistic Studies. Through me, I trust Professor Tomasi's greetings and welcome will reach Lina Meruane and the students who are starting their PhD adventure today. On my own behalf, I can say that I am representative in general and in this PhD program of the most European, most Eurocentric, most Western-centered of all disciplines, that is to say classical philology. But in a way, philology is literature, it nourishes it and it is nourished by it at the same time. And I'm proud that this year's course opens with a lecture of a writer who is able to say the marginality of Europe inversely proportional to the guilty arrogance of this continent. I read a short passage from her Against the Kids, and I read it in Italian just to make sure not to spoil it too much. Ma l'Europa, se la osserviamo bene, se la guardiamo attraverso una lente di ingrandimento e con occhi ben aperti, non è che un pezzetto di terra con una manciata di persone sopra, una porzione minuscola del globo. And Lina Meruane is a writer who, with her own biography, questions us about diasporas and about dispatri, expats, about countries and peoples that are being shuttered under our gaze. And she's also a writer and a scholar who began one of her novels by telling the despondency, the bewilderment, the loneliness, and at times the true despair you might encounter writing your doctoral dissertation. In her novel Nervous System, she describes, in Italian once more, le angosce causate da quella ricerca che era un carcere a vita, the anxieties caused by that research that was a lifelong prison. And may this not happen to you, of course, but it is perhaps physiological for it to happen at times throughout your PhD adventure. Do not feel lost and do not feel alone when it does, if it does, of course. Our whole doctoral committee, we all, as your professors and your mentors, we all are here ready to listen to you and to help you. And I hope that Lina Meruane's words, the ones she will speak today and the ones she has written, she will write, will guide you whether your research is in the field of literature, of philology, of linguistics. I hope her words will guide you to frequent and to question, to interrogate literature as the most powerful tool ever to shatter always your doubts and uncertainties. I hope her words will lead you to be able, both as scholars and as citizens, to think and to look beyond, to challenge our presence and its contradictions, and to have the audacity to imagine a different possible present. Thank you, therefore, to Lina Meruane, and once more, welcome to our students of our PhD program on behalf of Professor Franco Tomasi and myself. Thank you so much.
Now, finally, Lina Meruane. It's going to be quite tricky for me to speak about Lina Meruane in English, because I usually do it in Spanish, obviously, because like I'm a scholar in Latin American literature, but I will try to do so. So, Lina Meruane, Chilean, a third-generation descendant of a Palestinian migrant family, can be considered one of the most important contemporary Spanish language writers today, as attested by the prestigious José Donoso Prize she won in 2023. Her work consists of 5 novels, 2 collections of short stories, several books of non-fiction, straddling essay, autobiography, and journalism. Her oeuvre is widely translated internationally. In Italy, the novels Sangue nell'occhio and Sistema nervoso, as well as the feminist pamphlet Contro i figli, Against the Kids, have all been published by La Nuova Frontiera. Roberto Bolaño intercepted her value very early on, and in reference to one of her first works, the book of short stories Las Infantas, 1998, spoke of a literary power that, I'm quoting now, arises from the hammering of conscience, as well as from pain and the sense of what keeps elusive. After graduating in journalism in Santiago del Chile, Lina moved to New York, where after earning a PhD in literature with a dissertation on the narratives of AIDS, that has since become a reference book for cultural studies on both illness and sex dissident communities, she's now a professor in Latin American culture and creative writing at New York University. In that seminal book, Viajes Virales, Viral Voyages in English, an attempt to account for how Latin American HIV-positive writing has tried to answer the urgent demand for signification arising from the epidemic, the nomadic tendencies of the so-called pink cancer are related in an extremely lucid and suggestive way with globalization and its deceptive metaphors of circulation, reading the virus as an artifact of a global village, designed to disguise its underlying colonial features. These theoretical interests consistently spill over into her fictional books, as evidenced by the 3 novels that comprise her involuntary illness trilogy, Fruta Podrida, 2026, Sangre nel Ojo, 2010, and Sistema Nervioso, 2018, where the illness topic, socialized to the point of assuming the role of a real interpretative peak of contemporary world, is molded into narratives that are both visionary and provocative, imbued with lyricism and a sense of resistance. In all 3 novels, the center is occupied by the body, treated at the same time as an object of a meticulous study and as a constant source of awe, of wonder. It is the ideal catalyst for a dense and volatile writing, metamorphic by necessity in an attempt to chase its ever-changing object, the body precisely, with its deviations, excesses, smears, and mutations, captured and recorded with acute sensitivity and with a taste, at the same time, profoundly human and deliciously morbid. In stories steeped in autobiographical moods that work as hallucinated discursive self-therapies, but actually leap over gender boundaries, genre boundaries, and punctually disregard reading expectations. Likewise in Sangre nell'Ojo, literally blood in the eye, but translated as Seeing Red in English, perhaps her most famous novel. A medical narrative, an autoethnography of a congenital diabetes from which the author suffers, which escapes Lina's sense on the border between personal experience and pure imagination, and suddenly turns into a horror story, which tests the resistance of the categories of subjectivity and the dynamics of a global economy. Now, becoming Palestine. In 2013, Lina Meruane began to publish the first versions of an unstable, genderless, mutant book, to be understood as a perennial work in progress, a mobile and ever-evolving text in which the tribulation of a diasporic community, without losing its historical grip, are turned into a universal metaphor. Volverse Palestina, Becoming Palestine, is the chronicle of a Dublin migrant subject, a Palestinian family rooted in Chile, a Chilean transplanted in the United States, which in the description of a paradoxical homecoming carried out by the author on behalf of all those who have not had the chance to return, stands for an urgent gesture of solidarity and a powerful political critique, while becoming at the same time an occasion for a radical, more general rethinking of all identity arrangements, turning the writing into a restless device that investigates in the features written on the faces of a person encountered, in the mixed accents and confused tones of a tongue spoken, the proof of the cultural contradictions of which each body is the bearer, discovering the intertwined nature of every genealogy. Remaining aware of the danger of metaphors, which, as Susan Sontag points out, speaking of illness, run the risk of dehistoricizing concrete conditions of suffering by constructing specific narratives. Today, we will try to understand with Lina Meruane what it could mean for all of us, obviously starting for our respective positions of gender, race, social class, etc., what it could mean for all of us to become Palestine. So, thank you, Lina, for being here, and now we're going to listen to your lecture.
Oh, hello. So, good evening. I'm honored to be here and a little embarrassed by so many kind words here on the occasion of the contemporary Liminalities seminar organized by two prestigious international scholars, Gabriele Bizzarri and Annalisa Oboe. I'm also very happy to be back in this amazing university with so many of you. Thanks for attending this lecture on the Palestinian diaspora at the time of ongoing genocide, which is intended to exterminate civilians in Gaza and take over a land already devastated and made unlivable for locals. It has been no less than 395 days of genocide of the Palestinian people within a violent occupation that has lasted 76 years. So being here today is, in my view, a shared political statement against colonial violence, and also a way of becoming, all of us, a little Palestinian. So I thank you this opportunity to talk about, to say a word about genocide, and also to go back in history to talk about the Palestinian diaspora in Chile, which dates a century back, in a community that dubs itself Chilestinians. I actually have started a new project on the Palestinians that live in so many places. It's the largest diaspora community in the world, it is said. And so I have kept dubbing this community Palestinians, Colombiastinians, and so on and so forth. And I am rebaptizing these communities to make sure to keep at least part of the name Palestine alive, because it's a name that, as the people, is intended by colonization to disappear. So the title of the talk today is Chilestinians, Note on Migration, Assimilation, and the Myth of Palestinian Reawakening in Chile. Thank you, Gabriel, for being my technical assistant today. So this is the next slide. Allow me to begin with a quote. A journalist asked Ben-Gurion, founder of the State of Israel, as well as its first prime minister, what would happen to the Palestinians. His reply, this is 1948, his reply was that the old would die and the young would forget. But the young have not forgotten. They will never forget. These are the words of Nicola Hadwa, the trainer of Deportivo Palestino, the soccer club, the Chilean or the Chilestinian soccer club we will be talking about later on. One, years ago in New York, as I was going through my Palestinian travel notes, years ago, as I began writing down the trip that I had made, as I wrote about knowing so little about my grandparents' migration from Beyala to Chile, their making of a home away from home, years ago, a decade or so, as I interrogated my father trying to understand my own lack of understanding, years ago, indeed, the words assimilation, integration, and forgetting made sense to me. It seemed plausible, I pondered, that all those Palestinian migrants, mostly Christian Palestinians, who had abandoned their lands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, escaping discrimination and compulsory military service, as well as the shortages, starvation, and epidemics brought on by political instability and wars under the harsh rule of the Ottoman Empire, that those Palestinians who later left their friends and families under the 30 years long British mandate, who were forced to leave when in 1948 their territories were ceded to the State of Israel and terrible wars ensued, it was possible that all those Palestinians had renounced their identity. Or so I thought. It seemed conceivable, even believable, that they had wanted to establish themselves elsewhere and never look back, never return. The echo of Ben-Gurion's words, the old would die and the young would forget. But let us stay with the pioneering Palestinians of the early 20th century, among which were my grandparents and their siblings and cousins. They were mostly Christians and moved, not surprisingly, to a Christian continent, Latin America. But reasons were not merely religious. They were perhaps mostly economic. They had in fact heard of America, as the growing international commerce of Holy Land products, olive woods, mother of pearl, Nabi prophet Moses stone, and thus deemed the Americas a prosperous land for merchants, which is what Palestinians were to become. They tried countries like Cuba in the Caribbean, and Honduras or El Salvador in Central America, and Mexico and Brazil, Paraguay, Peru, and in even larger numbers, that thinnest of countries, Chile. Let me footnote for you some figures here. According to scholar Wael Hassan, Brazil is today home to the largest community of Arab descent in the Americas, an estimate of 7 to 12 million, or 3.5 to 6% of the population of Arab descent. That's a very, very big word, Arab. While in Spanish America, Argentina has an Arab descent of about 4.5 million. Let me add some more numbers. Estimates are that the early wave of Palestinian immigrants to the Americas reached 500,000. The highest percentage is considered to be in Honduras, where they make up almost 3% of the entire population, while the highest number of Palestinians is in Chile. Chile has the biggest Palestinian community outside the Arab world. There's a saying in Spanish: for every tiny village in Chile, you will find 3 things: a policeman, a pastor, and a Palestinian. A version of this saying is taken up by Palestinian US historian Rashid Khalidi, whose son lives in Chile. Quote, in every town, there is a Palestinian major, a deputy, and a football player. This is a very unique situation, he says. This might be a slight exaggeration if he means that all three, the major, the deputy, and the football player, are of Palestinian descent. But for sure, in the Chilestinian town where my father grew up, San Felipe, near the Andes, those three influential professionals would be Palestinians. So now I return to my narrative. In none of those countries, neither Cuba, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, Brazil, Paraguay, Peru, Argentina, Chile, were Palestinians greeted. But they were not rejected either, as they had been in the United States, where between 1917 and 1924, the US laws limited immigration of non-Anglo-Saxons, aiming to preserve a white ethnic hegemony. In an analogous racist line of thinking, Latin American criollo elites, criollos are the descendants of the Spaniards, of the Spanish colonizers. Latin American criollo elites welcomed all migration that would help whiten out the black and indigenous lineages. Arabs and Jews were certainly frowned upon, as they had been in Spain before their expulsion and/or conversion in 1492. However, because of the long centuries of proximity and racial mixing in Europe, both Arabs and Jews looked like the criollos or vice versa. And thus, it was not entirely clear to the criollos whether Middle Easterners truly qualified as non-whites. Because the Spaniards and the Portuguese were mixed, and then they came to Latin America and they were mixed, they were uncertain, they looked just like them. Whiteness, as Erika Beckman has noted, was a racial category that went far beyond phenotype to vouch for the virility, morality, and discipline of a homogenized national race. Arabs and Jews were indeed known for their morality and their work ethic. Perhaps for this reason, Latin American governments gave them the benefit of the doubt and allowed them to move in, but made sure to grant only white Europeans migratory incentives that Arabs and Jews were never entitled to. Not rejected, but not greeted. I just said this, but this is an understatement. For decades, Arabs were despised everywhere. As Antonia Rebolledo has claimed, prejudice was particularly intense in the upper classes. Their racism was voiced without qualms by El Mercurio, one of the oldest daily newspapers in Chile. In 1911, the conservative El Mercurio, which would later openly support the Chilean dictatorship, published an unsigned op-ed on the opening page complaining about the indolence and lack of oversight regarding the dangerous Arab migrants. Whether they are Mohammedans, read Muslims, or Buddhists, read Asian, what is seen and smelled from afar is that they are dirtier than the dogs of Constantinople. Read today's Istanbul, read Turkey, read Turks. And they enter and leave the country with the freedom that those same dogs enjoy in theirs. No one asks them who they are, where they come from, or where they are going. No one even checks whether or not they bring some of those horrible and mysterious plagues of the East. And this is how all the plagues that we suffer at the present moment have entered Chile through the great way of our indolence. Nothing is spared in this quote, full of negative words about Arabs and a lot of orientalizing ideas: dirt, disease, and dehumanization. It was not only the media, though. Chilean intellectuals and writers were concerned about the growing Arab and Jewish presence in the country. In 1936, Joaquín Edwards Bello, unable or unwilling, I would say, to distinguish them properly, expressed his negative view of Arabs, Syrians, and Jews, who he saw as the cause of the Chilean darker skin color in poor downtown barrios such as Recoleta, San Pablo, or San Diego. But as Safi and Agar point out, those traits were already part of the Chilean genetic makeup much before the Arabs arrived. 2. Not knowing the native language or speaking it with an accent, not understanding yet the social codes of the new land with customs alien to the locals, Arabs were othered and given derogatory names. Turcos, Turks, was the misnomer they received because until 1918, which is when the first wave of Levantine migration paused, their passports were issued by the Ottomans. Of course, the use of Turco ignored the distinction between Middle Eastern peoples, Arabs, Armenians, Syrian, Jews, Persian, Greeks, and of course Turks. And to add insult to injury, Turco was the name of the empire the Arabs were fleeing. As things were not easy, as they seldom are for migrants, they made their best to pass unnoticed. They silenced the narrative of their origin to the outside world. They translated their names into Spanish equivalents. My grandfather, Isa, or Jesus, became Salvador. His brothers rhyming Yadala and Atala turned into Natalio and Alberto. My grandmother, Milade, became Maria, and so on. They toned down their surnames as well, unless immigration officials had already done so at the entry point. So Meruane became Meruane, Tape, the very Chilean Tapia, and so forth. They swayed from the Greek Orthodox Church to the Orthodox Church of Antioch, to the Roman Catholic Church. They earned money as merchants and had their children educated in the public system, still free, still of excellence. Let me just for a second show you my dad in this picture. You'll see that, of course, I'm not asking you to guess where he is. I was just sort of wondering who you think the at least one Arab kid is in this school group, in this school photograph. If you can go to the next, Gabriele. So, okay, so there is my dad. I do think I have some resemblance, actually, especially in my younger pictures. But anyway, my point here was that, coming back to the notion that Arab children were a little indistinguishable of other children, how would you know, right? But still, the Arab families, the Palestinian families mostly, wanted to try to erase the signs of their belonging, of their origin. And so they swayed religion, they changed their clothes, they educated their children, and they married outside of their community so they would fully integrate. In the meantime, most lost their tongue. 3. Much attention has been placed upon the fact that Palestinians quickly learned the tongue of the new land, and that Palestinians ceased to speak their own to their children, that they stopped speaking Arabic even to themselves, that Arabic would only come out in dreams. And indeed, this is the story of my elders. My grandmother had arrived to Chile as a young girl. My grandfather in 1920 at the probable age of 15. By the time they met in Chile, both were fluent in Spanish. My grandfather never got rid of his accent, but made sure not to pass it along. Already in the 1940s, the community was losing the ability to even understand the language of origin. But I ask myself now, what exactly did this language of origin mean by then to my grandmother, who had learned to read and write in Spanish, my grandmother, who felt a stranger in Arabic and who couldn't speak it to her children? What did she consider her mother tongue to be? Or to bring this question closer to Silvia Molloy's phrasing, whose origin was conveyed in the use of the word origin? My contention here is that by stressing the notion of linguistic loss, the narrative of migration in fact conceals more than it explains. It reinforces the idea that the uprooting from a land and language signified the utter destruction of a cultural identity, as if the language of origin was the single component of cultural identity, and its absence was enough proof that the destructive force of assimilation, once completed, would be irreversible. But this idea of assimilation, destructive and successful only if destructive, belongs to the persuasive, however reductive and self-interested nationalist rationale that was in trend in Latin American historiography throughout the past century. It was very much in tone with the nationalist fantasy of racial homogeneity, which I now fear was somewhat better than the exclusionary racial othering we are facing today. In that model, national identity was seen as a fixed reality, as a stable, homogeneous construct that welcomed strangers only if they were able to leave their cultures behind. A model, the nationalist, astray from the way we now understand identities to be, not the possession of a set of stable characteristics, but the engagement in social practices and interactions, the heterogeneous, unstable, irreducible, liminal, always in flux making of political subjectivities. Since the 1980s, contemporary social thinkers, James Clifford et al., began complicating the understanding of cultural identity as a process rather than an essence, made up by a multiplicity of components, which may at times exist in a drowsy latency until they are activated, usually in response to a current event that threatens its survival. Because, to paraphrase Silvia Spita, who has critically studied transculturation processes in colonial Latin America, the stronger the assimilation process, the stronger too will be the reaction to cultural erasure. Culture, in other words, is extremely resilient. It gains strength precisely when it is attacked, endangered, denied, as Palestinian identity was. So in truth, they did not commit to disappear. Against all odds, they knit together a stronger community which, rather than fix its identity to a language, relied on other linguistic tools in the production of their cohesion. One of those instruments was sports, to which I will return later. The other was written media. I have already mentioned how the media, the Chilean upper-class media, attacked the migrants. Well, the Palestinians joined to celebrate or discuss social and political dilemmas in a surprising number of periodicals and magazines, some written entirely in Arabic, some bilingual. example, al-Murshid, the guide, al-Awatif, feeling, al-Munir, the torch, al-Shabiba, the youth, as well as the long-lasting and influential al-Watan, the nation, al-Islah, the reform, and Sharq wa il-Garb, east and west. Sorry, I'm destroying Arabic, but this is, I'm already destroying English as well, which actively informed the at-large Palestinian diaspora. The content of these periodicals suggests that Arabic migrants in Chile actively connected with others, regionally and transnationally, to defend the economic well-being and social reputation of the Haïla migrant community, and to demand their rights. This is suggested by Nadim Bawal Sawan, a very important Middle Eastern historian. No matter in what language, Arabic or Spanish, these newspapers played a critical role in the transformation of temporal migrants into an established diaspora. I'd like to say here to explain that a diaspora, a layered diaspora, it's not merely an immigrant community, because as French geographer Emmanuel Mamoun has noted, a diaspora contains several generations and a multipolar dispersion, as well as an interpolarity of relations between the various parts of the diaspora. In the context of this discussion, such a dynamic perspective is more useful than the rigid reification that characterizes diasporas as ethnic groups with exact frontiers. Even when Arabic was to be completely replaced by Spanish in periodicals such as Oriente, the East, and Mundo Árabe, Arab World, and even while the Palestinian intended to settle definitively in their host countries, the already formed Palestinian diaspora increasingly claimed its belonging to the Palestinian nation. And I think this is very, very important to my point. Four, the fantasy or the phantom of a successful assimilation and integration process also provided for decades an interpretative frame as to why so many Palestinian migrants postponed or disregarded a return to their cities, to their villages, to their homes, even before 1948, when their return was outlawed by the Israeli state, because there is, in fact, a law that makes the return of Palestinians impossible. Now, this is a narrative, and of course, history is made of narratives, as our friends historians here know, right? And so what I'm trying to say here, just in case this is not so clear, is that the notion, the nationalist frame of reading has made sure to claim that the Palestinians who stayed in Chile or elsewhere never wanted to return. And this is somehow proved by the fact that they are still there. But the fact is actually quite different. Present historical findings show to what extent this is an incomplete version of a complex history. There were, to be sure, decisive political impediments which were widely discussed in the Palestinian media in Chile and elsewhere. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, thousands of Palestinians had decided to go home, only to find that the British authorities had closed the doors of Palestine in their faces. This is perhaps not the place to discuss the specifics of the Palestinian citizenship law ratified in 1925, following the contentious pro-Jewish Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was commemorated yesterday. This is not the place, as I'm saying, to delve into the specifics of that law, which denied Palestinians their right of return and their nationality, while facilitating citizenship to the arriving Jewish European immigrants. It is worth knowing, though, that this reinvention of citizenship not only defied international treaties, but was unlike anything Great Britain had done throughout its colonial empire, writes Palestinian historian Adnan Musallam. In a few years, that British-conceived citizenship law disenfranchised some 10,000 Palestinians and provoked uprisings in protest of such restrictions. What I find most striking, but surely not at all surprising, is that the British mandate deemed all Arabs not only as former Ottoman citizens, but as ethnically Turkish. Purposely or not, and I am inclined to suspect this was truly convenient, the British chose to misread ethnic and cultural differences and saw in returning Palestinians underserving foreigners. The paradox being here that the British were foreigners themselves, the most foreign of all, if such a thing can be said of any one group in the multicultural Levant. Still, this gave the British a reason to deny Palestinians the historic ownership of their land, and even worse, established a legal precedent that lasts until today. The lack of both ownership and citizenship in Palestine immensely complicated not only the lives of the returning Palestinians, but also the well-being of the Palestinians in the diaspora. It placed a hold in their migratory status, in their international travel, in their application for new citizenship in the Latin American nations, which Palestinians were compelled to request since they now had no better option. My grandfather, to reference my family once more in this autoethnography of sorts, applied for and was granted Chilean citizenship in 1936. The document is here. This British aggression, contested everywhere, challenged the diaspora to take a position in the events back in Palestine. Likewise, it had the effect of strengthening abroad the sense of Palestinianness. 5. I began this conference by stating that I was too easily persuaded by the assimilationist narrative of a forgetting that was my own, as well as of a late awakening that was also mine. A nationalist narrative that problematically echoes the similarly nationalist ideas of Israel's founders, Theodor Herzl, Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and other Zionist leaders, the dying of the old, the forgetting of the young, and of the displaced. It took me some time and much reading and much writing of my own book to understand that my upbringing in isolation from both the Palestinians and the Chilestinian community was not representative of the affects towards Palestine in the community at large. More often than not, now I know, one should avoid assuming that the story of one family or a few families is the experience of them all. Let me clarify that we, the Meruanes, did not live amongst the lower class merchants of the Patronato neighborhood, but neither did we belong to the fancy Palestino social club where the Turco Nouveau riches mingled since 1948. My brothers and I did not attend the Colegio Árabe because by 1978, the year the Arab school was founded, we were already placed in another institution where we and other students were sometimes called Turcos. And because I did not study in the emblematic Universidad de Chile, I never heard of the Center for Arab Cultures, which had opened in 1966, nor joined the UJEP, the General Union of Palestinian Students that since the mid-1980s worked towards the creation of a Palestinian state. I had listened to plenty of romanticized family stories and ate on weekends Palestinian dishes prepared by a non-Palestinian cook. But I had almost entirely missed out on the Chilestinians. How was this possible in Chile, which was and continues to be the country with the largest, best organized, and most active group of individuals of Palestinian descent working on the question of Palestine? How, in a nation which, at the onset of the 21st century, began the process of professionalizing the pro-Palestinian movement? What might explain my family's total disengagement with politics was the Chilean dictatorship in which I grew up. Allow me to speak frankly. Throughout the 1970s, the Chilestinians would become politically at odds, with the upper-class members of the community fiercely organized against the socialist regime that had nationalized their industries, mostly textiles, and the working-class paisanos organized against the capitalist right-wing dictatorship that took over in 1973 with US backing. Those were the years in which economic neoliberal policies were cruelly applied, the years in which the Chilestinian community suffered a widening economic gap. That the Palestine Liberation Organization, OLP, under Yasser Arafat, and the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, headed by George Habash, had assumed an anti-imperialist and an anti-capitalist position made local politics in Chile even more acrimonious. Only violence against Palestinians at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in 1982 would bring the community back together. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it is when a community is attacked that the community and its sense of identity and belonging becomes stronger. 6. The slaughter of hundreds of Palestinian Muslims in the camps south of Lebanon, carried out by Lebanese Maronite Christians while overseen and fostered by the Israeli Defense Forces, provoked an emotion that transcended the community's earlier divisions and in Chile produced the first demonstration of unity amongst Palestinians. A sense of unity and strength that persists today. A sense of unity only increased in successive intensifications of the Palestinian crises. Not coincidentally, it is with a mourning sense honoring the Sabra and Shatila victims that a contemporary Chilean documentary on an internationally known Palestino soccer team begins. Read carefully the quote used by the non-Chilestinian director Aldo Guerrero. It does not mention the women and the children who were slaughtered in the camp, but rather the resistant fighters that were said to have been hiding there, the men who died defending the right to have a homeland. I'm sure this is echoing quite a bit. Contrary to what that politically charged opening might suggest, and this is really the opening of the documentary, contrary to what that politically charged opening might suggest, together with the evocation of the Palestinian flag in the film's title, Four Colors, is neither a documentary about the Sabra and Shatila massacre, nor about the ongoing Palestinian struggles. As said, it's a film about the Chilean soccer team, the Deportivo Palestino, whose story is punctuated by the history of the Chilestinian response to critical events in both of their homes, in both places of origin. Slide, okay, thank you. As the documentary unfolds, we learn that the Palestino Sportive Club, as it was called, was founded first as a tennis club in 1916 to work against Arab stereotyping and ethnic discrimination, the Turcophobia, as it's called. It was re-established, the club, as a soccer team in 1920 after the Balfour Declaration and coinciding with, as well as responding to, the establishment of the British Mandate when, as already said, the future of Palestinians would be decided. Deportivo Palestino's last incarnation as a professional soccer team occurred in the immediacy of the partition of 1948. The professionalization of Palestino came after the Nakba, which is how it's called, the catastrophe of 1948. Came after the Nakba, not before, notes on camera Ilan Pape, one respected revisionist historian. While lecturing in Chile, invited by the Palestino Social Club created in 1948, Pape adds that the impulse to relaunch the team was an effect of the Palestinian catastrophe, because, he claims, in 1948, everyone thought that Palestine was wiped out. When the problem started in Palestine, we wanted to create a team and name it Palestino, Palestine, so people would know us, Palestinians, recounts Carlos Asbun, a member of the first professional team in 4 Colors, the documentary. Soon after Palestino's president, and this is very interesting, soon after the foundation, Palestino's president received an offer of $200,000, which was a lot of money at the time, and still is, from the Jewish community in Chile to change the team's name from Palestino to Árabe, in line with the erasure that was part of the Israeli politics ever since, and which I have delved into in my book. In 1982, the 1982 massacre is yet another catastrophe where the community voices its indignation and its pain in Spanish, on the TV screen and the newspaper titles, through the persona of its well-known players. There is more to Palestino than its games, more even than winning or losing a match. It is what it represents, the reality of Palestine, its political present and its future, the Palestinian cause outside Palestine, and the Palestinian flag, forbidden elsewhere, promotes the Palestinian territory's green, white, black, and red colors, says one contemporary player on screen. 7. To come back to my point and begin to conclude, the public presence of Palestino as a Chilean football club is determined by significant political events in Palestine or in the refugee camps beside it, crammed with Palestinians. In other words, Palestino's trajectory reveals that against the official narrative produced in Chile and internalized by Chilestinian communities, against the nationalist narrative of exclusionary identities, integration occurred without the destructive form of assimilation described before. Palestinians became Chileans while maintaining their otherness, and without ever experiencing the need to wear a composite identity. It simply fused into a Chilestinidad, or Chilestinianness, that kept both identities and both loyalties. This is what is impressively documented in 4 Colors. So, to give another example, already in the mid-20th century, not all players were members of the diaspora. Some were called Zacarias, Atala, Abu Hamor, Hasbun, Islami, Hirmas, and so on. And others had recognizable Chilean surnames, Miranda, Núñez, Toro, Fernandez. Indicating who is who in an old photograph and yellowed newspaper clippings, one Palestino founder explains to camera this name variation with noticeable uncertainty. They probably had Arab mothers too, he says. Watching him speak, one can deduce that both the absence of Arabic as well as the mix of Arab and Spanish names did not make much of a difference then and continued not to matter when non-Chilestinians joined the team and assumed its uniform and its political cause. Those other Chileans, and an Argentinian, and a player born and raised in Palestine, had created a community of political and emotional affinities. And to be sure, even Aldo Guerrero, the non-Chilean director of the cited documentary, has taken upon himself to narrate what it means to be a Palestino player. 8. In closing, let me raise a final claim. The Chilestinian case shows that open forms of identification and multiple belongings are possible within the national framework, and therefore challenges essentialist narratives of identity so dangerously in vogue today, with its call to one language, one race, one faith, and the mandate to make the other within us be forgotten and disappear. But we will not forget. We will not go away. Gracias, many thanks, shukran. Gracias. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lina, for this illuminating lecture that as is usual in in things you do, brings together personal experience with social discourse, family history, cultural theory. So by tracing the history of Palestinian migration in Latin America, you have provided us, among other things, with a perfect case study in transculturation, which happens to be one of our keywords. So I found, as I think all of us, extremely suggestive the encounter you propose in the social discursive construction of the Chilestinian identity between two identity signs, the Latin American one and the Palestinian one, equally uprooted, if you know what I mean, or even better, both dramatically and productively also immunized with regard to the mythologies of origin and the naivety of essentialist rootedness. Mm-hmm. So I also find extremely comforting to imagine that in Latin America as well as in other peripheral areas of the global world, a resilient post-colonial knowledge works under the radar, countercurrent to the imported Western model of the national state, mm-hmm. Favoring the interweaving of multifocal belongings. So that was my commentary. It was illuminating for me. Mm-hmm. Now I gladly open to our audience for questions and feedbacks. So just please don't be shy. Yeah. Okay.
Could you stand up to see you? Thank you.
It's not a question, actually. It is kind of I was thinking about I completely identify with your story because my grandmother came from Lebanon. Mm-hmm. I'm from Uruguay, so I completely understand and also, but they forgot about the language. I mean, they completely forgot about everything. They just came to not came here because I'm not in Uruguay. They went to Uruguay and then it's, I mean, it's just, it's what I think. I mean, it's how destructive we are, and we went through the same thing, and your people, my people, with the same people, and we destroyed ourselves there, and we came to the same continent trying to find another way to live. I mean, it's just it was really.
Yes, no, I hear you, but I'm wondering about the word destructive. Because when I think about the story of grandparents not speaking Arabic to their children in order to have them have a regular life as the other local children, I think it's less destruction than a strategy. Because what I have found in my research is that the identity was not refused, was not denied within the communities or within the home. It was just that they needed to adapt, right? But the process actually is starting to invert, to become inverted. Because while grandparents only spoke amongst them maybe some words in Arabic, so the children wouldn't understand and would speak to them in Spanish or Portuguese or whatever the other language was, in order to make them belong and be comfortable in the new land. While they were doing this, they were also maintaining and telling their children not to forget. So there were multiple things happening at the same time, which I find more strategic than destructive. And what has happened is that I can see this in my own family, but I've talked about this with so many other families, not only in Chile, but elsewhere in Latin America, where the grandparents protected their children assimilated with the conscience of where the family had come from, for better or worse. And the grandchildren, which is my generation and the following generation, are returning to the lost stories, and in some cases to the lost language. So we have sort of the paradox of grandchildren relearning, so to speak, Arabic. So this idea of destruction is never complete, and sometimes it's less destructive than strategic, right? It's something that people are kind of enforced to do, and they accommodate it. They use what Josefina Ludmer calls las tretas del débil, like the tricks of the weak, right? You use the tricks because you cannot do otherwise, but that doesn't mean that your will has disappeared. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I mean, but I was talking about destruction within ourselves there. I mean, that. Can I say in Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ahora sí, gracias.
I will translate.
Okay. Voy al hecho de que, o sea, tanto. I can speak in English, okay. Even my great-grandmother and probably your family moved to America Latina in order to search for a new life, escaping what was happening there.
Mm-hmm.
And how destructive, I'm talking, what I meant is, in the 20th century, we are still destroying ourselves back there.
Uh-huh.
And how Lebanon also destroyed the Palestinians in 82.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened, something that happened in Uruguay, I don't know if Renzo, I studied anthropology back in Uruguay, and Renzo, he's a very well-known anthropologist, and he said like Syrian people and Lebanese people in Uruguay kind of almost forgot everything. He got so assimilated to the culture, Uruguayan culture, that it's not like it's very, even though in Uruguay we have a lot of people from Lebanon, they don't know it.
Yes, but this is one of the things I want to contest, right? Because I am seeing how the generation of the grandchildren are going back to the grandparents and the parents to reclaim this cultural silence, so to speak. And I have, for example, a student who is from Honduras, and she's writing about her family history. And what she tells me is that, and she's writing about this, that her father initially resisted the story, telling the story, but eventually became more and more interested in the story and has found documents that were stacked somewhere. They were not destroyed, they were put away. So there's something shifting where even those who kind of put away their identity are being pushed to remember. So there's of course differences in the ways in which people relate to their cultures. But I think it's interesting, and in the case of Chile, where at some point it was discussed, the idea that there was a reawakening of, what I found is no, there was no reawakening in the sense that has been described, like a century of forgetfulness and then reawakening. It has been continuously foregrounded, right? So just wait for the next generation. And I want to say also that this is not only the situation of the Arab migrants. This is happening with all migrant communities, or many migrant communities. In Chile, Italians, Croatians, Germans, etc., Jewish from all places. And this is interesting because a lot of people, or Galicians, a lot of people come to me and say, I read your book, I felt immediately identified. But in fact, they identified, but they are not Arabic descendants. They are from other communities.
No, actually, I'm here because my husband is trying to trace his Italian background. He found it, but I wasn't able to find mine because the name changed, and I haven't been really. I don't know the real surnames or the real names.
You have to do more research.
Yes.
It's somewhere. Yes, thank you. By the way, I think it's a really fascinating endeavor to try to trace back your family. It's very difficult, but it's really, really interesting. I mean, I found in the most strange places.
Yes, I mean, I have talked to everybody. I even sent emails to Lebanon, to the different universities, but I don't know, somewhere, somehow, the name completely changed, and I haven't, I'm really, basically from my grandmother, because I knew that she had this feeling of, but yeah, okay, hopefully I will find it.
Good luck, thank you.
Other questions? Otras preguntas? Altre domande?
Aquí hay una pregunta.
In qualsiasi lingua. Annalisa.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it was quite an engaging narrative that you produced for us today, and it's full of surprises in many ways, because the way you talked about the Palestinians not being welcome in Chile or in other countries preluded to a history of, you know, alienation and disaster and de-racialization or whatever it was there. But then the present or the recent past tells us a different story. And I was thinking of the role of memory in this. Memory is a very tricky process, isn't it? It is perhaps sustained by the desire to remember, but sometimes that goes hand in hand with the desire to forget, which is also part of trauma, of how trauma works. So I was wondering what the third generation, independently of real documents, because documents can be also tricky depending on how you interpret them, where you find them, who actually is delivering them. So it seems to me that the process of identification is going on, not of identity, of identification, which is very random in many cases. But it reminds me, and I'm probably wrong, actually I'm sure I'm wrong, but I'll say it just the same. It reminds me of the processes of African American people in the United States, and what the impossibility of going back to their roots and remembering in the present, as Toni Morrison does in her wonderful work, what you don't know about, but you reinvent because the present needs that.
Yes.
Okay, is that going on in what you say about Chilestinians, or is it just a kind of genealogical, historical research that is going on, looking for data, looking for stories that are not necessarily true, but close to the truth, rather than invented, as in the case of remembering?
Thank you for the question. It's a really, really interesting one. Of course, there is the el prurito, the desire to do archival work, right? To trace back the histories. What I found in my own work, let me start here, was that the family story was full of holes. The thing that I also discovered is that the stories that were passed along were the happy ones. And the sad ones, the difficult ones, the tragic deaths, the poverty, the difficulties were somehow silenced by the older generation. And I thought that that was a very interesting way in which a community binds and flourishes by constructing or building its identity on top of the good story, not the sad story, because that is a very destructive story. So I found myself in my research with so many ruins, the houses that were ruined, the stories that were ruined, the holes, the missing parts, right? And I thought, well, maybe the silence and the ruins are part of the history of what we cannot access, what has been taken away, what has been destroyed is part of the history of that diaspora, that pain. And colonization is really also a story of erasure and destruction of what remains, of the traces. So people cannot go back. So people cannot reclaim what was theirs. And I'm speaking of material things and also intangible things like stories, right? So it is a difficulty, and I think this is why one struggles and one wants to have archival data, right? The year and the ship in which the grandfather arrived, and all of this sort of starts we feel confident somehow when you do research that you have found the date, but it's just so small. And this is where reconstruction comes in. I think that one of the roles of writers who are doing the writing of memory, the writing of family stories, but even the fiction, the fictionalization of these stories, have a very important role precisely when archive is not enough and when there's so many holes. And then you start filling in the blanks and trying to imagine how that could have been, starting from the bits and pieces that are left, right? And so I think that, of course, it is incomplete and probably inaccurate, but it's also a way of filling in the blanks of erasure. Yes, I'm not sure I can answer properly your question. I'm not sure how one can reconstruct. Well, it's impossible.
Well, if I can add on to this,
yes,
but
please,
just in a dialogue, not just to comment in an appropriate way. I'm just thinking that doing postcolonial studies actually teaches you how to read the silences. You cannot invent or rewrite history if you have no words for it from whatever document or the past. So if you identify that there are silences there in that history, that there are holes, that are empty spaces that will not be filled, you know there's something was going on there. That is lost, but that was the way in which colonial archives were constructed. The voices of the subaltern are not there, the voices of discriminated people, the voices of black, the voices of women. And that is part of our postmodernity, late modernity, post-colonial, decolonial modernity, to actually bring that up as presence in many ways. The silences are presence, and you can actually work around them with other stories that you can imagine, remembering them. I think that is part of survival.
Yes, I do think also there's so much political work to do in underlining and showing out where there's sort of an endpoint and what has been done to all of that material. Yeah, thank you. But you also asked what is being done about that. I think there's a lot of narratives coming out, trying to piece together different stories, right? One of the things I did, for example, to understand what the story of my family had been, was to read many testimonies of older migrants that had been put together by historians, actually. And I could sort of understand some trends in the community. Even if it was not the story of my grandfather, I could sort of picture, right, what that would have looked like, what that might have looked like. So I think that the silence is important to show, and the ruins to make sure that we see them because they're part of this violence, the colonial violence, and at the same time sort of piece together with a collective story what could have been the story of your own family. Like the two things at the same time. Hay una pregunta ahí.
So thank you very much for your lecture. The statement by Gurion at the opening of your lecture alluded, or if not outright, pointed to the assumption that beliefs, traditions, stories, feelings, and pain, and the hopes that stood before an imposed threshold of change would be and remain unclaimed by future generations. And he did not appear concerned of what these younger generations may possibly adopt to replace what they forgot or what died out in order to create, nurture, and maintain a sense of self. And yet, an assumption, or rather a myth about liminality, is that it is a transitional state by nature, so you cannot inhabit it. You can just cross it and come out from the other side completely transformed. Eventually, it ends. And yet, what struck me was discovering through your words that the state of transition and liminality that the Palestinian diaspora abroad was forced to undergo was never meant to cease at all, because as they were prevented to go back to Palestine. And what really moved me was that, in your words, the process of becoming Chelestinian kind of disproves this myth of liminality being impossible to inhabit, because you proved that you can make a home in a state of flux, regardless of what the national narrative surrounding it is. And I believe that was the most touching point for me. So thank you for bringing your experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for commenting on that. That was a very sensitive reading. I do think that more and more people today have this experience, though. The sense that, because the the stable place is now a little bit, it feels like a fiction, like a construction. It's harder and harder to find somebody who has never moved out, whose family has not come from somewhere else. I used to teach a course on culture, and I would ask my students if they 3 questions the first day of class to identify themselves. And I said, please tell me where your family originates, what is home for you, and what languages you speak other than English. It was pretty interesting to hear what students would say, right? And so sometimes they would say, oh, various places, mix of people, and they knew very well where the parents had come from. It was very hard to find somebody sort of born and raised in New York for generations, so to speak. And then the question of home also had all sorts of inflections, right? For some people, home was where the family was, where the affection was, where the friends were, right? Where they had been born, where they had grown up, right? So even the answer to the question, what is home for you, was very unstable and very personal in its definition. And then the question of language, of course, was super interesting as well, but that doesn't come to the discussion. But yes, I think that the sense of instability and acknowledging and accepting, and even, if possible, enjoying, I think is more and more common. We tended not to know that our parents or our grandparents had come from somewhere else, even from the other town.
Would you believe, just a follow-up question, would you believe that this sense of having to own, almost as if it was something material, your identity, your sense of self kind of stems from the general global environment of capitalism? Because I think that in general we live in a world where identities and subjectivities have become very mobile, also because of the frequent dialogue between nations and countries and peoples. Mm-hmm. And yet we have been somehow swayed to believe that we belong somewhere and to some places or some ideal, as if identity is something physically rooted. And I was wondering how much of that is the inherent human need for returning somewhere, mm-hmm. or to
belonging.
Yes, to belonging, and how much of that is enforced by the idea that you have to own yourself and plant yourself somewhere to make sense of who you are.
It's an interesting question, because I think of it different and even contradictory answers to your question. I think that we have been taught to have a structure and a home, right? I'm not sure this is capitalism. I think this is the ways in which culture has developed, right? From the times of nomadism to settling, right? And the sort of the worth of making a productive life in a place, right? And raising the children, raising the cattle, growing food in the land. So this is something that I would say even is something that brought good to the people who, while they were nomads, were starving, basically, right? Or not living very well. So the comfort of home is something that we, I think, bring in our DNA, right? So this is one thing. I'm not sure capitalism has told us that we need to belong to a place. It could also be quite the opposite, right? Belong to many places. Don't belong to any place, just consume, right? So I'm not sure that the home narrative is necessarily directly connected to the development of capitalism. I'm not sure, but I'm really not sure. I'm not saying yes or no. I do think that there has been a nationalist pull to keep people together, especially if they all look alike, whatever that means, right? And so the framework of nation building is exclusionary in its definition, its early definition, right? And that is connected to owning a home, living in a city, living in a land, being a close community, right? And excluding the others. That framework is more of a modern framework, right? The moment of creation of nations, nation building. So I connect this idea of home, but especially the notion of excluding others from your home, whatever that is, in that framework. And I think that's the framework that has been crumbling because one, we cannot exclude others. Capitalism actually has enforced the fact that people not only move for pleasure and work, but also because of hunger, desperation, and war, right? And so that has complicated the picture so much. And I think this is why maybe we have candidates who are coming back to the notion of closing up, right? And protecting ourselves from migrants who eat dogs and cats of the neighbors. I'm sure you've heard. So I think that there's plenty of things happening. This is why I have conflicting ideas about what you're saying. I do think that culturally, we, or maybe, I don't know, different people are different, right? But we feel safety when we know we inhabit one place and we know our neighbors and we can chat with the man who sells the bread and the woman who sells the flowers, let's say. So that comfort is still within us that we want, right? But I also think that this has to do more with the emotional, with the emotions, which are attached to things and places. But I think it's an emotional need more than anything else.
That is comforting to hear,
okay.
to be honest. I was saying that is comforting to hear, so because it's very inherently human, and so we are still being human in a way when we honor that. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry.
I was seeing your point from the other side completely, because I was wondering about that. What does it mean for you to inhabit our confused scenarios of our globalized contemporaneity? Because in that scenario, that always in flux, I mean, the opening of the identity as a category, to transformation, to otherness, may see, I think, is always in peril to my eyes to see its emancipatory power contradicted, or even being used as an alibi to justify the dismantling of rights promoted by neoliberal economics.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the sinister narratives of neoliberalism that will use anything to just push forward their own plans. I'm sure you know that it is said that neoliberal politics are planned before crises. So when a crisis occurs, they can implement the plan. So I feel that this is happening more and more frequently, right? The implementation of drastic plans to undo all sorts of rights, and especially human rights. But I got lost with the question. Yeah. So this is that. And for me personally, I have chosen my I mean, on the one hand, I celebrate the possibility of transformation, which I think is against a conservative discourse, which is precisely to keep together whatever the definition is. So one part of me likes to think that one can continue to transform and adapt and change and accept. And the other part is the more sort of activist part, so to speak, which is to protect and defend and politically engage with certain values, which I still find important, and that where I'm not willing to just let go or to adapt, right? There's things that I find that are very important to keep. And then there's other things, but also at the same time, the things that are important to keep is to accept otherness. So this is my internal negotiation with. It's tricky. It's really tricky. I have to talk to myself over and over again. For example, I'm just going to give a very different example. I have always felt I am a feminist, right? But I was a hardcore feminist. So when the trans community came along, I felt, oh, wait, but they're going to go against our feminist achievements, right? Women have worked so hard. We have got all this done. Now here they come and they're going to take away that from us. And then I thought, wait, that's the way, anti-migration thinkers speak, right? So no. Let me have this discussion with myself. And then I thought, no. I have, as a feminist, as a woman, we have achieved a lot of things, difficult things to achieve, but we have to share them with others who are struggling, because this is the human thing to do, right? And so this is where the values have to, the strong-held values have to also find ways to negotiate with the changing world. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So this is my ongoing dilemma and thought process.
Sometimes it's just difficult to let go of our certainties.
Yes, absolutely, because one has built them, one has reflected on them, and then something comes along and one has to rethink everything. And this is uncomfortable. But it is important to be able to work with discomfort, right? Because otherwise we become monsters, I think. The bad monsters. There's some nice monsters. There's good monsters too. Yeah.
So, any other question?
So maybe just a very short one, Lina.
Yes.
Well, I don't even know if I know how to say that in English, but maybe later I'll try to translate it to Spanish, because I know I used to talk this language to you in general. But this is maybe a question that with a lot of scholars over here we already have in our room, in our classes, and it's the idea of being white, definitely white, in Padua, the university, and some way try to have something like an activist way to understanding what's going on in the world. And I'm going to be very short. I saw a few scholars over there drinking mate a few minutes ago, and I thought to myself that once, when I was younger, I thought I have to be a little Latin American to start working over there. And I start my own volverse latinoamericano in somewhere, you know. That's kind of a very violent process. When I talk to a lot of literary critics over there, and I'm coming right now reading back Volverse Palestina and looking at it like another anarchist pamphlet on do-it-yourself and being activist as a Palestinian if you're not Palestinian, as I'm a Venetian one, you know? So the violence in trying to be Palestinian, as I feel is the only way to continue my idea of activism in this way, is being as close as possible to Gaza right now, but obviously with all the contradiction you said before. And just, you know, closing, what I'm asking you is, I feel the pain of the contradiction of every kind of identity I try to wear, and every day this kind of jacket looks shorter and tighter and is not working, so I have to change it as fast as possible. So, like in the idea of being always in transformation and somehow being nothing. So, I don't know if you can maybe work a little on how to be Palestinian for us too.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that you are voicing something that is very important, because it does feel like we're changing clothes every day, right? And that's difficult, but maybe if we think about it in a different way, not so much as wearing a different identity, but actually committing to that identity. So the way I think about it is that even if half of my blood is Palestinian, I was not really raised like one. So what does it mean to become Palestinian? It's a process. And for me, it's not a process that has to do with melancholy, but has to do with political commitment. So, for example, I was awarded a prize of the Palestinian community in Chile. And somebody told me, do you want to wear a traditional dress to receive the prize? And I said, no, this is not the way I dress. And I am not performing my Palestinianness out of dressing in a way that I wouldn't. Or you know, putting a hat or you can do that. This is not the way I do it. So for me, it has less to do with the outer performance, and this is why I come back to the clothing, because I think it's an interesting point, but it has to do more with the kind of thinking and speaking and reading and working and doing in the everyday life towards what is happening. And this situation of genocide has made me work not non-stop, but almost, in spreading the word, keeping the idea of what's going on day after day, right? And trying to explain in all sorts of situations what the history of the situation is and what the colonial endeavor here is and what the alliances of the Western countries is and why. So all of this is part of a work, like a political activist commitment. It's not about performing Palestinian. Do you know? So I don't speak as a Palestinian. I speak as somehow somebody who brings along this memory, but not representing others, but helping the word to keep out, because the discourse, the Western discourse, the Israeli discourse are very, very strong. The Palestinians are not being heard enough, and their discourse is not creating any difference. So this is the kind of thing that I want to do personally, right? It's about the work that I'm doing, the commitment that I am engaging in. So this is my answer to the question. It's not about anything else than that. And I always say it's not nostalgia, it's not melancholy, it's engaging politically with a community that is attacked and threatened to its own disappearance. I mean, just to say one more thing, it's been almost a month now that no food is coming into the north of Gaza. It's amazing that we're not speaking and shouting more about this. It's incredible. But at the same time, it's completely credible. So anyway, so this is my becoming. It's never going to be a complete process. And just to give you one more thing, because I love to tell this story. I was once in Germany at a conference with Palestinian scholars. And so I was talking about Becoming Palestine, the book, right? Which is a very multiple title, because it's Becoming Palestinian or Becoming Palestine, right? It means two different things. And in Spanish, the word volver y volverse, the same verb, but one is to become and one is to return, right? So all these wordplay. So I was explaining this, and a Palestinian scholar stands up and says, you cannot become Palestinian because you have not suffered, you have not experienced the suffering of Palestinians, which is our identity. So you have no right, basically. So I kept silent, right, because I didn't really know how to answer to this, coming from a real Palestinian, a suffering Palestinian. But immediately after he finished, another Palestinian scholar intervened, and she said, first of all, the diaspora is also an experience of suffering and displacement of the Palestinian community. So even if she doesn't suffer in her body, her family went through a process, which is a painful process, and could not return. This is part of the Palestinian story. And then she said, and also defining an identity only through what has been taken away from it and the suffering is also not a good idea, because Palestinian identity is much more than being bombed, destroyed, killed, imprisoned, maimed, etc. Right? And I thought, wow, this was just a lesson for me. I couldn't really speak, right? I let them speak. So I mean, there are so many ways of engaging with this idea of becoming, and also the care of not stepping over others. And thank you for that question, because it's nice to come back to the question that we started with.
So basically, I think the way I experienced the term becoming Palestinian, it was more about, or it was a lot about like getting out of the disconnection, and because it's like the disconnection has become a very like a survival mechanism, and becoming Palestinian for me is also just like a process of like reconnecting, and it's about connecting with the pain also, and just seeing what the pain does afterwards. And for sure, it's like subjective, a subjective experience for everyone. And I also, so before I came to this lecture, I want to thank you first. But before I came, I didn't know about your work or your book. But I saw that it was about the identity quest, and it was about Palestinians, like the Palestinian diaspora. And I'm kind of appreciate spaces where there is like this strong connection with what's happening, like the reality of the current time, and also about the identity quest, because I can kind of like I was in like the identity quest for some time, and I'm Lebanese Armenian and diasporan Armenian, and moved to Armenia and a few years ago, and kind of being back, or also trying to find a definition of what it means to move to Armenia, because it's not exactly like being back, but then there was like a lot of kind of like questions being raised, and what is the definition of that identity then, because the language is different, the culture is like kind of different, and comparing to the Armenian culture that I grew up in. And I think last year during the ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, like that moment of pain is kind of like the pressing thing. It's like, no, it's like part of you. And I think those are like the moments that just tear you apart, but also at the same time just remind you, just like the memories are just like so clear, because you connect to the story very deeply, like you connect to the story of your ancestors, you just, like the connection is just very present. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can say goodbye, and to, okay, so it's important for me to, again, to say thank you to Lina for her brilliant lecture, for her generosity, and okay.
Thank you. Thank you.